The music in the cantina pounded like a heartbeat. Too loud, too close, too alive. Jake Morrison hated it. That was probably why he kept coming back. The crowded room gave him something to focus on besides his memories. Dim neon lights painted the walls in shifting shades of red and blue, while voices from a dozen different species blended into a constant roar. Pilots celebrated successful runs. Traders argued over contracts. Mercenaries laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Nexus Station never slept. Not really. At any hour of the day, ships arrived from distant corners of the galaxy, carrying travelers, refugees, soldiers, and dreamers. Everyone eventually found their way to the cantina. Everyone except the ghosts. Those followed Jake everywhere. He sat alone in the darkest corner he could find, turning a glass of amber liquor between his fingers. The ice had long since melted. The drink was his third. Maybe his fourth. He wasn't keeping count anymore. Keeping count meant admitting there was a problem. Jake took a slow sip. The alcohol burned going down. Not enough. Never enough. Across the room, a group of young pilots were celebrating something. Their laughter echoed through the cantina. For a moment, it reminded him of another group, another table, another lifetime. Men and women who had once laughed exactly the same way. Most of them were dead now. His jaw tightened. 2 years. 2 years since the war ended. 2 years since Zirion Prime. 2 years since the sky turned red. The memories arrived uninvited. Explosions. Emergency alarms. The smell of burning steel. Friends screaming over comm channels that suddenly went silent. Names carved into memorial walls. Faces he still saw every time he closed his eyes. Jake looked down at his glass. The reflection staring back looked older than it should have. War did that. A shadow suddenly fell across the table. Every muscle in Jake's body tightened instantly. Old instincts. The kind that never went away. Slowly, he looked up, and felt his blood turn cold. The creature standing before him was impossible to mistake. Tall. Thin. Its arms hung almost to its knees, ending in curved claws sharp enough to tear through armor plating. Its head was triangular and insect-like, with massive compound eyes that reflected dozens of tiny images at once. A Zarian. The same species humanity had fought during the bloodiest war in modern galactic history. The same species responsible for Zirion Prime. The same species responsible for thousands of human graves. Around them, the noise of the cantina seemed to fade away. Jake's hand slowly tightened around the glass. The Zarian wore no armor, no weapons. Only a simple gray station jumpsuit. But that didn't matter. Some scars didn't care about uniforms. Neither of them spoke. For several long seconds, they simply stared at one another. Then the Zarian did something Jake never expected. It lowered its head. Not aggressively. Respectfully. Almost nervously. When it finally spoke, its translated voice was quiet. "Captain Jake Morrison?" Jake's expression hardened. "What do you want?" The alien shifted uneasily. Its claws curled slightly. "I know who you are." Jake said nothing. The Zarian swallowed. A surprisingly human gesture. Then it spoke the words Jake least expected to hear. "My name is Kareth." A pause. "My father died at Zirion Prime." Jake's grip tightened. The cantina disappeared. The memories came rushing back. Fire. Smoke. Death. Kareth looked down. "My father was one of the officers who ordered the attack." Silence. Heavy and suffocating. Then the alien met Jake's eyes. "I didn't come here for revenge." Another pause. "I came to thank you." For the first time that night, Jake was genuinely speechless. Because sometimes the hardest thing a soldier faces isn't another battle. It's discovering what comes after the war. But Jake recognized the species immediately. Manthari. He had fought alongside them during the war. The alien pulled out the chair across from Jake and sat down without asking permission. Its movements were quick and precise like everything else about its kind. When it spoke, Its voice was a series of clicks and whistles that somehow formed words in standard. "Human Morrison," the creature said. "I have been looking for you." Jake's hand moved toward the plasma pistol hidden under his jacket. Old habits died hard. "What do you want?" "My name is Zar. I served with the 3rd Manthari Scout Division during the Zirion conflict. We fought on the same battlefields, you and I. Though I do not think we ever met directly." Jake remembered the 3rd Division. They had been good fighters, fast and deadly. The Manthari were natural hunters, evolved from predators on their homeworld. They could track prey across vast distances and strike without warning. During the war, they had been valuable allies. "I remember your unit," Jake said carefully. "You fought well." Zetar's head tilted to one side. "As did yours. That is why I sought you out. I have questions that have troubled me since the war ended. Questions about your species. I'm not a scientist or a diplomat. I can't tell you about human biology or culture. That is not what I wish to know." Zaktar leaned forward. "I want to understand how you fight, how your people think during combat. The things I witnessed during the war, they do not match what I know about other species." Jake took another drink. The alcohol was starting to make everything feel fuzzy around the edges, which was exactly what he wanted. "We fight to win, same as everyone else." "No," Zetar said firmly. "That is not true. I have fought beside many species. The Althari are brave but predictable. The Voron are strong but slow to adapt. The Crystalline Collective fights with perfect coordination, but lacks creativity. Your people are different." "Different how?" Sector was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Other species fight until they calculate that victory is impossible. Then they surrender or retreat. It is logical. It preserves lives and resources for future battles. But humans, they fight beyond the point where logic says they should stop. They fight when victory is impossible. They fight when death is certain. They fight as if losing is not an option, even when it clearly is." Jake said nothing. He had heard similar observations from other aliens who had served in the war. It always made him uncomfortable. "I watched human soldiers hold positions that could not be held," Zar continued. "I saw them attack forces 10 times their size. I witnessed acts of courage that bordered on madness. And sometimes, impossibly, they won battles that should have been defeats. Sometimes we got lucky. Luck does not explain what I saw in Zerion Prime during the final assault. Luck does not explain Firebase Delta. Luck does not explain how Sergeant Rodriguez single-handedly disrupted 3 Zerion divisions for 6 months." At the mention of Rodriguez's name, Jake's grip tightened on his glass. Danny Rodriguez had been a friend, one of the few who made it through the war alive, though not unchanged. "You knew Rodriguez," Zar observed, watching Jake's reaction. "We served together. He was a good soldier. He was more than that. He was something that should not exist. A single individual who became a legend among the enemy. Syrian warriors, creatures who fear nothing in the natural world, began to refuse assignments to worlds where he operated. They believed he was a supernatural entity." Jake almost smiled at that. Danny would have found it funny. He had always said that half of warfare was psychological. "Rodriguez was just a man," Jake said. "Yes, exactly. Just a man. That is what I cannot understand. How does one human being alone and outnumbered by thousands become something that entire armies fear?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake stared into his drink, seeing reflections of things he wished he could forget. After a long silence, he looked up at Zatar. "Why does it matter? The war is over. We won. Your people survived. Isn't that enough?" "No," Zar said. "It is not enough because the war changed everything. Before the Zirion conflict, humans were seen as newcomers to the galaxy. Young, inexperienced, not particularly dangerous. Now every species knows what you are capable of. They know that humans will do things others will not do. They know that you cannot be predicted or controlled in the same way as other beings. And that bothers you." "It terrifies me," Zar admitted. "And I am not alone. There are those among my people, and others, who believe that humanity may be more dangerous than the Zirans ever were. At least the Zirans were predictable. They conquered for resources and territory. We understood their motives. But humans fight for reasons that make no sense to us. You fight for concepts, for ideas, for people you have never met." Jake finished his drink and set the glass down with more force than necessary. "If you're so scared of us, why are you here talking to me?" Because I fought beside humans during the war. I saw the same soldiers who committed acts of terrible violence also risk their lives to save wounded enemies. I watched humans show mercy when they had every reason for revenge. I do not believe your species is evil, but I do not understand what drives you. And you think I can explain it? I think you can tell me stories, real stories, from someone who was there. I have heard the official reports and the propaganda broadcasts. I want to know what really happened. I want to understand the humans I fought alongside. Jake was quiet for a long time. He thought about the friends he had lost, the battles he had survived, and the things he had done that still kept him awake at night. He thought about Amy Collins and her impossible defense of Firebase Delta. He thought about Danny Rodriguez and his one-man war against an entire species. He thought about Lisa Hayes and the price she paid to save civilians on New Portland Colony. Most of all, he thought about himself and the choices he had made on Zarian Prime. If I tell you these stories, Jake said finally, you might not like what you hear. War changes people. It makes them do things they never thought they could do. Sometimes those things are heroic. Sometimes they're not. Zar nodded slowly. I understand. But I must know. The galaxy has changed, and my people need to understand their place in it. They need to understand what humanity truly is. Jake signaled the bartender for another drink. It was going to be a long night. All right, he said. I'll tell you about the war, but we're going to need more alcohol. Jake stared at his fresh drink for a long moment before he began to speak. The alcohol was making the memories easier to access, but also harder to control. He could feel them pressing against his mind like water against a dam. Firebase Delta, he said quietly. That's where I'll start. You mentioned it earlier, so you must know something about what happened there. Zar leaned forward slightly. I know the official reports. A small human garrison held off a massive Zarian assault for 3 days. The casualties were heavily in favor of the defenders. What I do not understand is how such a thing was possible. The base was nothing special, Jake began. Just a forward observation post on the edge of Zarian space. 12 soldiers, a communications array, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. The woman in charge was Sergeant Amy Collins, a combat engineer from Nevada. She was 26 years old and had been in Nano, the military, for 8 years. Jake paused to take a sip of his drink. The cantina noise seemed to fade away as he spoke, as if the universe was giving him space to tell his story. Collins was good at her job. She could build things, fix things, and blow things up with equal skill. She had a reputation for being stubborn. Her commanding officer said she never knew when to quit. They meant it as a criticism, but it turned out to be the most important quality she could have had. When did you realize the base was in danger? Zar asked. 3 days before the attack. Our long-range sensors picked up Zarian fleet movements heading toward Delta's sector. Command ordered an immediate evacuation. Standard procedure was to pull back to the main defensive line and abandon forward positions when faced with overwhelming force. Jake's voice grew harder. Collins refused the evacuation order. Zar's compound eyes seemed to shimmer among his people disobeying. Orders was almost unthinkable. The Manthari had evolved as pack hunters with strict hierarchies. Orders were followed without question. She refused. What was her reasoning? The base controlled the only safe jump point into that system. If the Zarians took it, they could bring their entire fleet through and attack our colonies from behind. Collins calculated that even a few days' delay would give our fleet time to reposition. She asked for volunteers to stay with her. How many stayed? All of them, Jake said simply. 11 soldiers chose to stay, and almost certainly die rather than abandon their posts. They could have left. No one would have blamed them, but they stayed. Jake remembered the recording of Collins' final transmission to command. Her voice had been calm and professional as she explained her decision. She had not asked for permission or forgiveness. She had simply stated what she was going to do, and why. What did they do to prepare? Zar asked. Collins had 3 days to turn a simple observation post into a fortress. She used every trick she had learned in 8 years of military engineering. They stripped the base's walls for metal plating and built improvised armor around critical positions. They took apart non-essential equipment to make more weapons and ammunition. Jake could still picture the base's layout in his mind. He had studied the after-action reports obsessively, trying to understand how 12 people had accomplished the impossible. The most important thing Collins did was psychological warfare. She knew the Zarian were natural predators, who relied on their enhanced senses, so she decided to turn those senses against them. "How music?" Jake said with a bitter smile. She rigged the base's communication array to broadcast human music at specific frequencies. Death metal, to be exact. The kind of music with screaming vocals and pounding drums that most humans find difficult to listen to. Sector's head tilted in confusion. "I do not understand. How is music a weapon? Zirion hearing is much more sensitive than human hearing. They use sound to hunt and navigate." Collins discovered that certain frequencies disrupted their sensory organs, causing disorientation and pain. She essentially turned the entire base into a giant speaker that made it impossible for the Zerans to function normally within a kilometer radius. "That is creative," Zaytar admitted. "But surely they could have simply destroyed the broadcast equipment." They tried, but Collins had hidden speakers all over the base and the surrounding area. Every time the Zerans thought they had silenced the music, it would start up again from a different location. They spent hours hunting for equipment that wasn't there, getting more frustrated and disoriented with every minute. Jake took another drink. The next part of the story was harder to tell. The real battle started on the second day. The Zirian commander had finally figured out how to partially shield his troops from the music's effects. They came in waves, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. 12 humans against how many Zerans? The first wave was about 200. Standard Zerion assault doctrine called for a quick, decisive attack. They expected to overrun the base in minutes. Jake closed his eyes, remembering the footage. He had seen the Zerians had moved like a swarm of deadly insects, their natural speed and agility making them almost impossible to target. Against any normal enemy, their tactics would have been devastatingly effective. Collins had prepared for exactly this kind of attack. She had spent 2 days turning the base into a maze of kill zones and choke points. Every approach was covered by multiple firing positions. Every corridor had been rigged with explosives. The Zerans found themselves channeled into areas where their numbers became a disadvantage. But surely they adapted after the first attack failed. They tried. The second wave came from multiple directions simultaneously. The third wave included flying units that tried to attack from above. Each time Collins and her people were ready, they had contingency plans for every possible approach. Zakar was silent for a moment. How many humans were lost after 2 days of constant fighting? None. Collins had positioned her people perfectly. The base's defenses were designed to maximize the effectiveness of a small force against a large one, but it couldn't last forever. Jake's voice grew quieter. By the third day, they were running out of ammunition and explosives. The Zirian commander had figured out most of their tricks. He brought in heavy weapons and began systematically destroying the base's defenses. That is when they should have surrendered. Collins had one more card to play. She had rigged the base's fusion reactor to explode if overrun. Not immediately, but after a 15-minute delay, just enough time for the attacking force to get comfortable and bring in reinforcements. The implications of this hit Zaktar immediately. She was planning to take as many enemies with her as possible. More than that. She calculated that the explosion would destroy the jump point itself, sealing off the system for months. The Zerans would have to find another route to our colonies, giving our fleet time to prepare. Jake remembered reading Collins' personal log entries from those final hours. She had been methodical and calm, making arrangements as if she were planning a routine mission rather than her own death. The final assault came at dawn on the third day. 300 Zirion warriors, supported by heavy weapons and air cover. They broke through the outer defenses and began advancing on the bases. Core, did Collins activate the reactor? She started the countdown. 15 minutes until detonation. But something unexpected happened. The explosion wasn't necessary. Zector leaned forward, his alien features showing intense interest. Collins and her people didn't just fight the final assault. They turned it into a trap. She had rigged the base's interior with one last surprise. As the Zerians poured into the building, she triggered shaped charges that brought down entire sections of the structure. The attackers found themselves buried under tons of debris, while the humans were safe in reinforced bunkers. How many Zerian casualties? 273 dead. The survivors retreated in complete disorder. Collins turned off the reactor countdown with 30 seconds to spare. Jake finished his drink and signaled for another. The hardest part of the story was still coming. The rescue fleet arrived 6 hours later. They found Firebase Delta still in human hands, still broadcasting death metal at maximum volume. Collins was alive but badly injured. She had lost her left arm and most of her hearing from the explosions. 3 of her soldiers were wounded, but would recover. A complete victory, Zetar observed. Yes and no, Jake said sadly. Collins saved the system and delayed the Zerion advance by weeks, but the cost was higher than anyone realized at the time. She spent the rest of the war in medical facilities, dealing with injuries that would never fully heal. The music that saved her base had damaged her own hearing permanently. Did she consider it worth the cost? Jake was quiet for a long moment. I asked her that question once after the war ended. She said she would do it again without hesitation. She said that's what soldiers do. They hold the line no matter what. Zaktar processed this information silently. Your people embrace sacrifice in ways that other species cannot understand. Amy Collins didn't see it as a sacrifice, Jake replied. She saw it as doing her job. That's what makes it so disturbing to think about. For her, choosing to stay and fight was the most natural thing in the world. The cantina had grown quieter as the night wore on. Most of the other patrons had left, returning to their ships or quarters. Jake and Zetar sat in their corner, surrounded by empty glasses and the weight of difficult memories. The alien had listened to the story of Firebase Delta without interruption, but Jake could see questions forming behind those compound eyes. You mentioned Rodriguez earlier, Jake said, breaking the silence. Danny Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant in the 5th Reconnaissance Battalion. That's the second story I'll tell you about what one human can do when he decides to become a ghost. Zar shifted in his chair. The name Rodriguez had come up in Zerion intelligence reports throughout the war. Among Jake's people, the man had become something between a legend and a nightmare. I knew Rodriguez before the war, Jake continued. He grew up in Texas, joined the military when he was 18. He was good at his job, but not exceptional. Average height, average build, nothing that would make you look twice at him on the street. That was probably his greatest asset. What made him volunteer for deep reconnaissance missions? Danny said he was tired of fighting defensive battles. He wanted to take the war to the enemy, make them afraid in their own territory. Command was looking for volunteers to operate alone behind enemy lines for months at a time. Most soldiers wouldn't even consider it. Danny volunteered the same day they announced the program. Jake remembered the briefing, where they had explained the mission requirements. Months of isolation on hostile worlds with no backup, and no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. The psychological evaluation alone had eliminated half the potential candidates. The first world they sent him to was called Kepler 442b. The Zerans had taken it 6 months earlier, and were using it as a staging area for attacks on human colonies. Intelligence estimated 3,000 enemy troops on the surface, plus orbital defenses and regular supply convoys. One human against 3,000 Zerion, Zector observed. The mathematics seem impossible. That's what everyone thought. Command expected Danny to gather intelligence and maybe conduct small sabotage operations, hit-and-run attacks on supply depots, that kind of thing. Instead, he decided to study the enemy. Jake paused to take another drink. The alcohol was helping him access memories that he usually kept buried, but it was also making them more vivid than he wanted. Danny spent the first month just watching. He learned their patrol routes, their communication schedules, their behavioral patterns. He discovered that Zerans are creatures of habit. They like routine and predictability. It makes them efficient hunters, but it also makes them vulnerable to someone who understands those patterns. How did he use this knowledge? He started leaving traces of his presence in specific locations, not accidentally, but deliberately. A footprint here, a broken branch there, evidence that someone had been watching their patrols. The Zerion found these signs and began hunting for him. Jake could still picture the intelligence reports they had received from Danny during those first weeks. Dry, factual descriptions of enemy troop movements and supply schedules. There had been no hint of the psychological campaign he was planning. The Zerons sent out hunting parties to find him, 20, 30 soldiers at a time, following the trails he had left. They were confident they would catch him quickly. Zerans are natural predators after all. Hunting is what they do best, but they never caught him. No, they never even came close. Danny would lead them on chases that lasted for days, always staying just ahead of them, always leaving just enough evidence to keep them following. He would guide them through the worst terrain on the planet. Swamps, mountain passes, areas where their natural advantages were minimized. Zaktar's mandibles clicked softly. He was exhausting them. More than that, he was teaching them to be afraid. After a few weeks, the hunting parties would return to base, tired, frustrated, and empty-handed. They started reporting that their quarry could move through solid rock, that he could be in two places at once, that he wasn't entirely human. Jake remembered reading those intercepted Zerion communications. The growing confusion and fear in the enemy reports had been almost amusing at first. Later, as the psychological campaign intensified, they had become genuinely disturbing. Danny escalated the campaign gradually. He began appearing in impossible locations. Zerion sentries would find evidence that someone had been in their secure compounds, places that should have been completely inaccessible. Equipment would be moved. Supplies would disappear. Messages would be left in locations that required advanced climbing skills to reach. How was he accomplishing these infiltrations? Patience and planning. Danny would spend days studying a single target, learning the guard rotations, identifying blind spots, figuring out the timing of supply deliveries. Then he would wait for the perfect moment to strike. He never stayed long enough to be detected, never took more than he needed, never left obvious evidence of what he had done. Jake's voice grew quieter as he continued. The psychological impact was devastating. Zerion commanders started receiving reports of a ghost warrior who could walk through walls and appear anywhere at will. Sentries became nervous and trigger-happy. Patrol leaders began making mistakes, second-guessing their own instincts. One human was disrupting an entire army. 3 armies, actually. Word of the ghost warrior spread to other Zerion units in the sector. Commanders started requesting transfers away from Kepler 442b. Some units refused deployment to worlds where Rodriguez was operating. Sector was silent for a moment, processing this information. Among his people, fear was a rational response to genuine threats. The idea that one individual could terrorize thousands of warriors through psychological manipulation was difficult to comprehend. What was Rodriguez's ultimate objective? To make them afraid of shadows, to turn their own hunting instincts against them. Danny understood that the mind is the most important battlefield. If he could make the Zerion afraid of their own territory, he could neutralize their numerical advantage without firing a shot. Jake remembered the final reports from Kepler 442b. The Zerion garrison had become increasingly paranoid and ineffective. Units were spending more time searching for the Ghost Warrior than conducting their assigned missions. The operation lasted 6 months. By the end, Danny had documented every aspect of Zerion military operations on that world. Troop strengths, supply schedules, communication protocols, defensive positions. He had also eliminated key personnel through carefully planned ambushes. How many enemies did he kill? 17. Always officers or technical specialists, never ordinary soldiers. Each death was designed to maximize the psychological impact while disrupting their command structure. The Zerions began to believe that their ghost warrior could identify and target their most important personnel with supernatural accuracy. Jake paused to finish his drink. The next part of the story was harder to tell, because it showed a side of human nature that even he found disturbing. The most effective part of Danny's campaign wasn't the infiltrations or the ambushes. It was the waiting. He would disappear for weeks at a time, leaving no trace of his presence. The Zerions would begin to relax, thinking that their tormentor had finally left or been killed. Then he would strike again, in a location they thought was completely secure. Psychological torture, Zacher observed. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Danny turned an entire planet into a haunted house. The Zerions never knew when or where he would appear next. They couldn't sleep peacefully, couldn't relax their guard, couldn't trust their own senses. What finally ended the operation? Command recalled him when our main fleet was ready to retake the system. By that time, the Zerion garrison was so demoralized and disorganized that the assault was almost unnecessary. 3,000 enemy troops surrendered with minimal resistance. Jake signaled the bartender for another round. His hands were shaking slightly, and he wasn't sure if it was from the alcohol or the memories. Danny came back changed. He had spent 6 months living like a predator, thinking like a predator, becoming something that other intelligent beings feared. That kind of existence leaves marks on a person's soul. Did he continue with similar missions? He volunteered for 2 more deep reconnaissance operations before the war ended. Each time he became more effective and more isolated from normal human contact. By the time the ceasefire was signed, Danny Rodriguez had become the most feared individual in Zerion space. And after the war, Jake was quiet for a long moment. After the war, Danny had trouble adjusting to civilian life. He had spent so much time alone, so much time thinking like a hunter, that he couldn't relate to normal people anymore. He lives alone now, in a cabin in the mountains of Colorado. He doesn't like visitors. Zakhtar leaned back in his chair. Your species produces individuals who can become nightmares made flesh. This is what terrifies other civilizations about humanity. Danny never saw himself as a monster, Jake replied. He saw himself as a soldier doing his job. The fact that he was so good at it that he could turn psychological warfare into an art form that just made him more human, not less. I do not understand the distinction. Jake looked directly at the alien across from him. Jake stared at the bottom of his glass for a long time before speaking again. The alcohol had made his thoughts fuzzy, but the memories remained sharp and painful. He could feel Zinitar waiting patiently across the table. Those alien eyes reflecting the dim lights of the nearly empty cantina. The third story is the hardest one to tell, Jake said finally. It's about Captain Lisa Hayes and what happened at New Portland Colony. If you want to understand why humans fight the way we do, this is the story that explains everything. Czar remained motionless, sensing that this tale would be different from the others, more personal, more painful. Lisa was a medical officer attached to the 7th Colonial Defense Force. She had been a doctor before the war, specialized in emergency medicine. When the fighting started, she volunteered for military service because she wanted to help wounded soldiers. She never expected to become a soldier herself. Jake's voice grew softer as he continued. New Portland Colony was home to about 50,000 civilians, mostly families of military personnel stationed throughout the sector. It was supposed to be safe, far behind the front lines. The Zarians weren't supposed to be able to reach it, but they did reach it. Intelligence failed. A Zarian strike force broke through our defensive perimeter and began orbital bombardment of the colony. They targeted civilian areas first, trying to cause maximum casualties in panic. The colony's defense forces were outnumbered 10-1. Jake remembered the emergency broadcasts from New Portland. Desperate calls for reinforcement, casualty reports that grew worse by the hour, and finally the terrible silence when the communication arrays were destroyed. Lisa was working at the colony's main hospital when the attack began. The building was supposed to be protected under galactic warfare conventions. Medical facilities are considered neutral ground even during active combat. The Zirans ignored those protections. They attacked a hospital. They did more than attack it. They made it a priority target. The first orbital strike took out the building's power grid and emergency generators. The second strike breached the outer walls. Then they sent in ground troops to finish the job. Jake took another drink, trying to wash away the taste of memories that never seemed to fade. Lisa had about 300 patients in the hospital when the attack started. Wounded soldiers, sick civilians, women, and children. Most of them couldn't be moved safely. What did she do? She made a choice that still haunts me. Lisa ordered her medical staff to continue treating patients while she prepared to defend the hospital alone. She sent most of her people to evacuate, the patients who could be moved, and told the rest to keep working no matter what happened. Zector's mandibles clicked softly. One medical officer against an entire assault force. Lisa had access to something that most doctors don't. The hospital stored experimental combat stimulants designed for human special forces, drugs that could enhance reaction time, increase pain tolerance, and boost physical strength. They were supposed to be used only in emergency situations and only in small doses. Jake's hands began to shake as he continued. The stimulants came with warnings. Prolonged use would cause permanent neurological damage. A full dose could burn out a person's nervous system completely. Lisa knew this when she injected herself with the entire supply. She chose to sacrifice her own health. She chose to become something that could protect her patients. The stimulants don't just enhance physical abilities, they also affect the mind, removing fear and pain responses, increasing aggression and tactical awareness. Lisa turned herself into a human weapon. Jake closed his eyes, trying to block out the images that came next. He had seen the security footage from the hospital's cameras. What Lisa Hayes had done in those final hours was both heroic and terrifying. The Zirian assault team expected to find a medical facility full of helpless civilians. Instead, they found a nightmare. Lisa met them at the main entrance and held them there for nearly 4 hours. How is such a thing possible? She used everything available as a weapon. Surgical lasers became cutting tools that could slice through Zirian armor. Medical equipment became improvised explosives. Operating tables became barricades and shields. Lisa turned the hospital into a killing ground. Jake's voice grew as he continued. The stimulants made her faster than any normal human, stronger than any normal human, and completely without fear. She fought like a machine designed for one purpose: to kill anything that threatened her patients. How many enemies did she face? The assault force included 43 Xerion shock troops, elite soldiers, the best their military had to offer. Lisa killed them all, every single one. And she did it while suffering wounds that should have killed her 10 times over. Zar was silent for a moment, processing this information. 43 trained warriors defeated by one medical officer. The security cameras recorded everything. I've seen the footage, and I wish I hadn't. Lisa continued fighting even after taking injuries that would have stopped anyone else. Broken bones, severed arteries, burns from energy weapons. The stimulants kept her moving, kept her fighting, long after her body should have shut down. Jake paused to wipe his eyes. He wasn't sure if the tears were from grief or from the alcohol, but they wouldn't stop coming. When the fighting ended, Lisa collapsed in the hospital's main corridor. She had saved 800 lives that day, 300 patients and 500 medical staff, and evacuated civilians. But the cost was everything she had. Did she survive? Physically, yes. The stimulants had burned out most of her nervous system, but the doctors managed to keep her alive. Mentally and emotionally, though, Lisa Hayes died in that hospital corridor. What survived was something else. Jake's voice became barely a whisper. She spent her final months in complete paralysis. Couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even control her own breathing without machines. But her mind was still active. She was aware of everything around her, trapped in a body that no longer responded to her will. That is a terrible fate. The worst part was that she knew she had won. The doctors would tell her about the people she had saved, the families that were reunited because of her sacrifice. Lisa would try to smile, but her face couldn't move. All she could do was blink once for yes and twice for no. Zar leaned forward slightly. How long did she survive in this condition? 3 months. The doctor said her brain was still trying to send signals to muscles that could no longer respond. Eventually, the strain became too much. She died quietly one morning, while listening to her favorite music. Jake finished his drink and set the glass down with trembling hands. I visited her a few times before she died. I would sit beside her bed and tell her about the war, about the people she had saved, about how the galaxy remembered her sacrifice. She would blink once to show she understood. What did you learn from these visits? That Lisa never regretted her choice. Even knowing the cost, even facing death as a prisoner in her own body, she would have done the same thing again. When I asked her if she thought it was worth it, she blinked once. Yes. The cantina had become completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the life support systems. Even the background music had stopped playing. Jake and Zetar sat in silence, surrounded by the weight of Lisa Hayes' story. Your people transformed themselves into weapons to protect others, Zetar observed finally. Even your healers become warriors when necessary. Lisa wasn't a warrior, Jake corrected. She was a doctor who did what she had to do. That's what makes her story so important. She didn't fight because she enjoyed it, or because she was trained for it. She fought because people were depending on her. And this willingness to sacrifice everything for others. This is common among humans. Jake thought about all the soldiers he had known during the war. The ones who had lived, and the ones who had died. The heroes, and the broken ones who couldn't find their way back to normal life. More common than it should be, he said quietly. We fight hardest for the people we love. We sacrifice the most for the people we're trying to protect. And sometimes, like Lisa, we become something terrible and beautiful at the same time. I am beginning to understand why other species fear humanity. Fear us if you want, Jake replied. But remember that every terrible thing we're capable of, we do for love. Lisa Hayes became a monster for 4 hours so that 800 innocent people could live. That's the kind of monster humanity produces. Zakar was quiet for a long time. What happened to the people she saved? They lived. They went on to have families, careers, normal lives. Most of them probably don't even remember her name. But they're alive, because one doctor decided that their lives were worth more than her own. Jake signaled the bartender for another drink. There was still one more story to tell, and it was the hardest one of all. The cantina was almost empty now. Only a few late-night drinkers remained at the far end of the bar, speaking in quiet voices about things that didn't matter. Jake and Zetar sat in their corner booth, surrounded by empty glasses and the weight of 3 terrible stories. The alien had listened without interruption, but Jake could see that each tale had disturbed him more than the last. "There's one more story," Jake said finally. "The last one." "It's mine." Zar remained perfectly still. He had been waiting for this moment since their conversation began. Jake Morrison's own story, the personal account that would explain why a human war hero now sat alone in Kantas, drinking himself into oblivion. "I commanded the 3rd Battalion during the final assault on Zarian Prime," Jake began. 800 soldiers under my direct command, part of a larger force tasked with ending the war once and for all. We knew it would be the last major battle of the conflict. Jake's voice was steady, but Zetar could see the pain behind his eyes. This story was different from the others, because Jake had lived it, not just witnessed it. Sirion Prime was their homeworld, the place where their species had evolved, where their civilization had begun. It was heavily fortified, protected by orbital defense platforms, and millions of ground troops. Intelligence estimated that taking the planet would cost us 100,000 casualties, maybe more. Did your commanders consider negotiation? They tried. For months, diplomatic teams had been working on a peaceful solution. The Zarian Hive Queens were willing to discuss terms, but they refused to surrender unconditionally. They wanted to keep their military forces intact and maintain control of several key worlds. Jake paused to order another drink. His hands were shaking badly now, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could continue talking. The problem was that a conditional surrender wasn't enough. Too many humans had died during the war. Too many colonies had been destroyed. The public wanted complete victory, total defeat of the enemy. Our political leaders needed to deliver that victory no matter what the cost. So, they ordered the assault despite the potential casualties. They ordered something worse than an assault. They ordered us to make the planet uninhabitable, not just defeat the military forces, but destroy the infrastructure that supported civilian life. Make it impossible for the Zirion to ever use their homeworld as a base of operations again. Zector's compound eyes seemed to dim. "You were ordered to commit genocide." "Not directly." The orders were carefully worded to avoid using that term. "We were told to target military installations, industrial facilities, and strategic resources. But everyone knew what it really meant. You can't destroy a planet's life support systems without killing the civilians who depend on them." Jake took a long drink before continuing. "The assault began with orbital bombardment of key targets, power plants, water treatment facilities, atmospheric processors. We told ourselves we were hitting military targets, but we knew better. Those facilities supported millions of civilian Axarians. Did you object to these orders? I should have. I knew it was wrong. Knew it violated everything I had been taught about honorable warfare, but I also knew that refusing orders would mean court-martial and replacement by someone who would carry them out anyway. So I convinced myself that following orders was the lesser evil. The admission hung in the air between them like a physical. A weight. Jake had never spoken these words aloud before, not even to the military psychiatrists who had tried to help him after the war. My battalion was assigned to destroy the planet's main water purification complex. It was located in the capital city, surrounded by civilian housing and schools. Intelligence estimated that destroying it would affect the water supply for 10 million Zarians, including children. Including children, Jake confirmed quietly. The facility was defended by military units, so we told ourselves it was a legitimate target, but we knew that destroying it would be a death sentence for everyone in the city. Jake's voice grew even quieter. The attack began at dawn. My soldiers were good at their jobs, professional and efficient. They broke through the facility's defenses in less than 2 hours. The Zirion defenders fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Did they attempt to surrender? Near the end, yes. When it became clear that the facility couldn't be saved, the Zirion commander tried to negotiate terms. He offered to surrender his forces in exchange for guarantees that the water treatment plant would be spared. Jake closed his eyes, remembering the moment when everything changed. I was the ranking officer on the scene. The decision was mine to make. I could have accepted the surrender and found another way to complete the mission, but my orders were clear. Destroy the facility no matter what. What did you choose? I chose to follow orders. I rejected the surrender offer and ordered my troops to complete the destruction of the water treatment plant. Within minutes, the facility was reduced to rubble. 10 million Zerans would now face slow death by thirst and disease. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the cantina seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Jake's labored breathing. But that wasn't the end of it. Jake continued. The Zerion commander had one final message for me before his forces were eliminated. He said that his people would remember what humans were capable of. He said that even if we won the war, we would lose our souls in the process. Did his words affect you? Not at the time. I was focused on completing the mission, on bringing my soldiers home safely. It wasn't until later, when the reports started coming in about civilian casualties, that I began to understand what we had done. Jake finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. The water shortage hit the civilian population within days. Hospitals couldn't function without clean water. Children began dying of preventable diseases. The elderly and sick were the first to go, but eventually the death spread to healthy adults. How long did this continue? Weeks. The planetary government tried to organize emergency distribution of bottled water, but there wasn't enough for everyone. Families had to choose which members would receive rations and which would go without. Parents watched their children die of thirst while enemy soldiers maintained control of the remaining water sources. Zaktar was completely motionless now, his alien features showing something that might have been horror or disgust. The Hive Queens finally surrendered unconditionally. After 3 weeks of watching their people die, they agreed to all human demands in exchange for immediate humanitarian aid. The war was officially over, and humanity had achieved total victory. At what cost? 7 million civilian deaths from disease and dehydration. Another 3 million from starvation when the food distribution system collapsed. The children were the worst part. Intelligence estimated that 2 million young Zerans died because of our actions. Jake's voice broke completely now, and tears began flowing down his face. I killed 2 million children by following orders. I told myself I was being a good soldier, doing my duty, serving my species. But in the end, I was just a mass murderer with a uniform. The responsibility was not yours alone. That's what the psychiatrist told me. That's what my commanding officers said during the debriefing. That's what the politicians said when they gave me a medal for completing the mission. But it doesn't matter who gave the orders, or who shared the responsibility. I was the one who pulled the trigger. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. After the war ended, I tried to go back to normal life. I had a wife, a house, a job waiting for me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reports about civilian casualties. Every time I looked at a human child, I thought about the Zerian children, who would never grow up because of what I had done. Is that why you drink alone in cantas? I drink because it's the only way to sleep without nightmares. I sit alone because I can't stand being around normal people who think I'm a hero. They see the medal on my uniform and thank me for my service, not knowing that I'm responsible for one of the worst atrocities in galactic history. Sector was quiet for a long time before speaking. Your species won the war, but at the cost of your own humanity. That's exactly right, Jake replied. We proved that humans will do anything to protect what we love, even if it means becoming monsters. We'll sacrifice our own moral foundations to ensure victory. And the terrible thing is that it worked. The galaxy knows now that humans are capable of genocide if pushed far enough. And this knowledge terrifies other species. It should terrify them. It terrifies me, because the worst part isn't what we did to the Zerans. The worst part is that most humans consider it justified. They see the civilian deaths as an unfortunate necessity, the price of ensuring that our own children would be safe. Jake stood up unsteadily, leaving money on the table for their drinks. You wanted to understand why humans fight the way we do. Now you know. We fight like we're already dead, because we'd rather be monsters than victims. We fight without limits, because we believe that protecting our own people justifies any action, no matter how terrible. And you carry the guilt for all of this. I carry the guilt for my part in it, and I'll carry it until the day I die. That's the price of being human. Zatar. We're capable of incredible heroism and unspeakable evil.